She was dragged through town on a wagon rope until a giant cowboy stepped out and cut the line. "Someone, please stop this," the woman whispered, her voice barely carrying over the grind of wagon wheels as the rope around her waist dragged her across the dusty street, not violently enough to injure her, but cruelly enough to make every step feel like a public sentence. And those trembling words were the only plea she allowed herself, as townsfolk looked on with a mixture of curiosity and fear, each one telling themselves they had no right to interfere in whatever dispute the merchant and his daughter had fallen into. But everything changed the instant the wagon jerked forward and she stumbled again, her boots scraping against the ground, because that soft whisper, fragile, defeated, almost invisible, found its way to the ears of a stranger stepping out of the blacksmith's awning, a giant cowboy whose silhouette swallowed half the sunlight as he paused mid-stride and murmured, almost to himself, "No woman should ever sound like that." And those quiet 7 words cut deeper through the crowd than the rope cutting across her waist. He walked forward with the slow, certain pace of a man who did not second-guess his own convictions, his shadow falling over her like an unintended shield. And when the driver snapped the reins to keep moving, the cowboy's deep voice rose again, calm yet unyielding. "That's far enough," a sentence that made the horse hesitate, and the murmuring crowd fall utterly silent. For even before anyone recognized him, everyone could feel the weight behind his tone. The woman lifted her head at the sound, surprised to find not anger or pity in the stranger's eyes, but something steady, anchoring, a wordless promise that whatever shame had been forced onto her did not belong to her anymore. And though she could not speak, he seemed to hear every fear still trapped in her tightening breaths. "I don't know what they accused you of," he said softly as he stepped fully into the horse's path. "But dragging a woman like freight? Not in front of me." And the driver sputtered in protest while the sheriff pretended not to notice. Yet none of it mattered because the cowboy's presence alone unsettled the street, making people shift and murmur as if the earth itself had chosen a side. The woman's knees weakened, not from exhaustion, but from the impossible relief of hearing a single human voice say the thing no one else dared. And as the giant cowboy planted his boots, every heart on the street realized the same truth she did. The line meant to break her had just met the one man willing to cut it. The wagon driver stiffened when the giant cowboy refused to step aside, gripping the reins like a man who believed authority came from holding leather rather than holding truth. And though he tried to sound confident as he barked, "Move along, this is town business," his voice wavered the moment the cowboy shifted his weight forward, not threateningly, just firmly, as if the ground itself trusted him more than the man on the seat. The woman braced herself, expecting the scene to escalate into something loud or violent. Yet the cowboy surprised everyone by keeping his tone steady, almost gentle, when he answered, "Town business shouldn't look like cruelty." And those words sent a shiver through the line of onlookers who had been too afraid to voice what their hearts already knew, prompting even the sheriff to clear his throat and pretend he had been on his way over all along. The horse snorted anxiously, sensing the tension long before the humans sorted through it, and the cowboy placed one large hand over the rope at the woman's waist, not pulling, not cutting yet, simply stopping its forward motion with the quiet assurance of someone who believed a single act of decency could still shift a town's conscience. And the woman looked up at him in disbelief, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment rather than injury, finding herself caught between gratitude and confusion as she whispered, "You don't even know me." To which he replied with a single, low sentence that made several people look away in shame. "I don't need to know you to see this is wrong." The driver opened his mouth to argue again. But the cowboy's presence had already unsettled him, and when he tried urging the horse forward, the animal refused, stamping once as if agreeing with the stranger blocking its path. A few townsfolk murmured that maybe the whole punishment had been exaggerated, that maybe they'd been too quick to watch and too slow to question, while others shifted uneasily, realizing the rope felt heavier now that someone had challenged the reason behind it. The woman straightened slightly, not out of pride, but because the cowboy's calm defiance lent her a dignity she hadn't felt in days, and her voice trembled only once when she said, "They won't listen to me," before falling silent again, unsure whether speaking would help or worsen things. But the cowboy didn't look away. Nor did he judge her, simply answering, "Then they can listen to me," with a resolve that turned the restless street still, for his stance made one truth undeniable. Whatever happened next, she would not walk the next step of that rope alone. For a long, suspended moment after the cowboy declared they would listen to him, nothing in the street moved. Not the horse, not the crowd, not even the dust drifting in the afternoon light. And into that hush the cowboy slowly crouched beside the woman, not touching her, not speaking, simply lowering himself to her level in a gesture so unexpectedly gentle that several townsfolk exchanged guilty glances, because the silent respect in that single movement exposed how cheaply they had valued her dignity compared to a stranger who'd only been watching for mere minutes. She looked at him through strands of hair shaken loose by the rope's pull, her breath catching as he reached for the knot with careful fingers, not tugging yet, only examining it as if the weight of the rope mattered because she mattered. And the driver shifted uneasily on the wagon seat, suddenly aware of how cruel the scene appeared when contrasted against a man treating her as if she were made of something rare, not something disposable. The woman didn't speak a word. She couldn't, not with the crowd staring and her heartbeat thudding painfully in her ears. But her eyes widened when the cowboy glanced up at her for the briefest second, offering a quiet nod that told her she didn't have to justify anything, didn't have to defend herself, didn't have to fear that he might step aside and let the humiliation resume. And that reassurance, delivered in complete silence, washed over her with more comfort than any apology the town could have offered. Slowly, he stood again, placing himself between her and the wagon as the sheriff finally approached. Though even he seemed reluctant to interrupt whatever understanding had settled between the two. And when the sheriff asked, "You plan to make trouble, son?" the cowboy didn't answer with words, simply shifted his broad frame a little farther forward, the kind of move that said he wasn't there to cause trouble, only to end the kind that others had tolerated too long. A murmur rippled through the crowd as people recognized the unspoken truth, that the cowboy didn't need to raise his voice or his fists because his stillness was the loudest statement anyone had made all day. And the woman felt her breath steadier now, not because her situation had changed yet, but because someone had finally stood beside her, someone whose silence held more protection than all the town's laws. Without saying a word, he rested his hand lightly on the rope. And although he hadn't cut it yet, everyone watching understood the same thing she did. The line that had been used to shame her would not stay tied for much longer. The sheriff's boots thudded against the wooden planks as he stepped off the boardwalk, trying to project authority, even though the weight of the moment had already shifted toward the giant cowboy standing in the road. And when he barked, "That rope stays until I say otherwise," the words rang hollow, because even he could hear the uncertainty beneath them. The cowboy kept his back to the sheriff, his attention focused on the woman whose breath trembled behind him. And for the first time since her ordeal began, she felt the faintest flicker of something hopeful. Not safety yet, but the possibility of it, as he moved one step closer to the wagon, blocking her completely from the driver's impatient glare. The driver gave a harsh scoff and lifted the reins again. But the cowboy finally spoke. His voice low and firm and calm as a stone in a riverbed. "You pull that horse one more inch, and you answer for what follows." And though he didn't raise his tone, everyone felt the unshakable promise threaded through those words, strong enough to make even the sheriff hesitate. The woman swallowed hard, unable to understand why a stranger would place himself between her and a punishment the town had accepted so easily. And when she whispered, almost without meaning to, "Please don't get hurt because of me," the cowboy turned his head just enough for her to see the steady certainty in his eyes before replying, "Hurt comes from standing aside, not stepping in." A sentence that made several townsfolk lower their gazes in shame. The sheriff tried again to assert control, saying something about law and civic order, but the giant cowboy finally faced him, not confrontationally, just honestly, and said, "Law doesn't mean dragging a woman down a street to settle personal grudges." And his even tone made the sheriff glance at the crowd, as if searching for support that no longer stood with him. The woman felt her knees weaken when the cowboy placed one hand deliberately on the rope, his fingers curling around it with a resolve that silenced the last of the murmurs. And when the driver leaned forward to protest, the cowboy cut him off with a single sentence spoken like a verdict. "This ends now," after which he drew his knife. Not flashing it, not threatening anyone, just raising it with quiet authority, as if he were cutting nothing more dramatic than a stubborn fence line. The sheriff took one step forward, then stopped, realizing the town was watching not him, but the man who'd chosen mercy over spectacle. And in that charged heartbeat, the woman held her breath as the cowboy lowered the blade to the coarse rope, the street narrowing to the moment where dignity and injustice finally met their dividing line. The moment the knife touched the rope, it parted with a soft snap that seemed far too gentle for a scene that had held the entire town in a chokehold, and the loose end fell harmlessly to the dirt, as if choosing to abandon its purpose. The woman felt the sudden absence of tension around her waist, like a breath she had been holding for days, her body swaying slightly from relief rather than pain. And before she could steady herself, the giant cowboy turned, slipping an arm beneath her elbow. Not grabbing, not lifting, just offering balance with the same quiet respect he'd shown since stepping into the street. And she accepted it because her legs were trembling more from emotion than exhaustion. A wave of whispers rippled through the onlookers, some shocked, some relieved, some ashamed. They hadn't spoken first. But the cowboy ignored them all as he guided her toward the shade beside the mercantile's porch, his movements slow and deliberate, as if refusing to treat her as a problem to be solved or a spectacle to be removed. He knelt once more, this time to loosen the remaining coil of rope from her waist, his touch careful and professional, and when she flinched out of instinct, he paused, giving her a small, reassuring nod that let her know he would move only at her pace. The sheriff muttered something about sorting this out, but his voice had lost its edge, drowned beneath the quiet sincerity of the cowboy's actions. And when the woman whispered, "I'm all right," the cowboy didn't counter her or coddle her, simply said, "Let's get you out of the sun," a practical kindness that steadied her more than any dramatic rescue could have. He fetched a clean canteen from his saddle and offered it to her with both hands, making sure she could take it herself, and she drank slowly, her breath finally smoothing into something steady as the warmth of humiliation began to lift from her shoulders. Nearby, townsfolk began drifting apart, murmuring that perhaps things had gone too far, that maybe no one had truly understood the situation. Yet none approached her. Only the cowboy stayed, giving her space while making sure she wouldn't collapse in the overwhelming stillness that followed the end of cruelty. She glanced up at him, studying the calm in his expression, the quiet strength in the way he stood like a barrier between her and the remnants of the crowd. And though she didn't know his name or his purpose, she felt something unmistakable settle in her chest. This man hadn't saved her for gratitude or attention. He had stepped in because someone needed to, and because he couldn't stomach a world where no one did. When the crowd finally thinned, and the street settled into an uneasy quiet, the cowboy didn't ask her to explain anything or hurry her to her feet. Instead, he simply walked to his horse, untied the spare blanket from the saddle, and returned to drape it around her shoulders with a gentleness that made her throat tighten. For no one, not her accusers, not the sheriff, not even the townsfolk who claimed to care for fairness, had offered her warmth in days. And in that single silent gesture she felt a kind of humanity she had nearly forgotten existed. He didn't speak, didn't hover, didn't prod, just stood close enough that his presence formed a barrier between her and the remnants of shame still lingering in the street. And when she finally pushed herself upright, her legs trembling slightly, he steadied her with one hand at her elbow, waiting for her to find her own balance before guiding her toward his horse with an unspoken question in his eyes. "Do you trust me enough to leave this place?" She hesitated only a second, not because she doubted him, but because she had never been given the chance to choose her own direction. And when she nodded, the smallest, weakest nod, he lifted her gently, not cradling, not displaying, simply helping her settle onto the saddle as if she were something fragile but not broken. And the way he stepped back afterward, giving her space even while guarding her perimeter, made her heart twist with a quiet, unexpected sense of safety. He mounted behind her, not pressing close, keeping just enough distance to respect her fear while still ensuring she would not fall. And as the horse started forward at a slow, careful pace, she felt the wind shift around her in a way that made the world seem larger, kinder, as though the town behind them were already losing its hold over her. She didn't look back. She couldn't. And the cowboy didn't ask her to, staying silent in a way that acknowledged her past without demanding its details, his steady breathing a calm rhythm behind her as the road opened into a wide stretch of open land where no one shouted, judged, or pulled her by a rope. The simple sounds of hooves and wind became their language, a quiet conversation between two souls who didn't yet know each other's stories, but understood each other's pain. And when she finally dared to lean the smallest bit into the warmth of his presence, he shifted just enough to let her know that he would hold steady for as long as she needed, not claiming her, not directing her, only carrying her away from the place where her dignity had been taken, and into a silence where she could begin to breathe again. They rode until the town was no more than a distant smudge behind them, swallowed by dust and memory. And when the horse finally slowed near a quiet stretch of cottonwoods beside the river, the cowboy dismounted first, offering his hand only when she hesitated, letting her decide whether she wanted the help. She accepted it with trembling fingers, and as her boots touched the ground, her breath wavered, not from the ride, but from the sudden stillness, because silence meant there was nothing left to distract her from the truth she had been carrying alone. He didn't ask anything, just moved a respectful distance away, giving her space while remaining close enough that she knew she wasn't abandoned, and the gentleness of that choice, his patience, his lack of demands, unraveled something inside her that had been stretched too tight for too long. She wrapped the blanket around herself and sank onto a fallen log, her shoulders curling inward as the early evening light caught the dust on her skirt. And for the first time since the rope touched her waist, she let herself breathe without fear of who might be watching. The cowboy leaned against a tree trunk, arms loosely crossed, gaze on the river instead of her face, as if to say, "You are safe enough to speak, or safe enough not to. Both are fine," and that wordless reassurance was what finally broke the fragile dam inside her. "They said I stole from my father," she whispered, her voice thin but steadying with each syllable. "But all I did was refuse to marry the man he wanted." And though she expected disbelief or judgment, the cowboy didn't shift, didn't tense, didn't question her, only nodded once, a slow and grounded motion that felt like an invitation to continue. She went on, halting and quiet, explaining how refusal had been labeled defiance, how defiance had been twisted into accusation, and how accusation had turned into the cruel punishment she'd been dragged through. And each confession left her feeling smaller, lighter, as if she were releasing stones she'd been forced to carry in silence. When she faltered, staring at her hands, the cowboy finally spoke, his voice low enough that it blended with the river's steady murmur. People punish what they don't understand, doesn't make them right. And those simple words, no lecture, no disbelief, made her eyes sting because they were the first she'd heard that didn't twist her story into something convenient for someone else. She looked up then, meeting his gaze through the fading light, and in his expression she found something she hadn't expected. Not pity, not anger on her behalf, but quiet recognition, the kind a person gives when they know what it means to be judged by people who never cared to know the truth. They had barely begun following the riverbank toward the next settlement when distant hoofbeats cracked through the quiet like a warning, and the woman stiffened at the sound, her fingers tightening around the blanket as if afraid the rope she had only just escaped might reappear, but the cowboy steadied her gently with a hand near her shoulder. Not touching, only grounding, before turning toward the approaching dust cloud with the calm of someone who had prepared his whole life for moments exactly like this. The riders slowed as they neared, revealing 3 men from the town, one the driver, another a shopkeeper eager to prove loyalty to the wrong people, and the third a cousin of the man she had refused to marry. And though none carried weapons in hand, the tension wrapped around them like a second set of reins as they called out accusations meant more to intimidate than to justify, their voices too loud in the open air as if volume might make their story true. The woman stepped back instinctively, but the cowboy moved forward with a steady, unhurried stride that forced the riders to stop several paces short, his towering frame turning their confidence brittle in seconds. And when the cousin spat out, "She comes back with us. My uncle's claim stands." The cowboy didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, only asked in a tone so calm it made the air tighten. A claim on what? As if he genuinely wanted them to hear the emptiness of their own argument. The driver bristled, insisting the town had a right to correct its own, but the cowboy shook his head once, slow and certain, replying, "Correction isn't dragging someone through dirt. That's humiliation, and that's done." A simple line delivered with such unshakable conviction that the men shifted uneasily, their bravado cracking in the face of someone whose authority didn't depend on badges or crowds. The woman watched from behind him, her heart thudding as the men exchanged glances, none willing to be the one to push past the stranger blocking their path. And when the cousin began to argue again, the cowboy interrupted with a single sentence that landed like a command. "If she returns anywhere, it'll be where she chooses, not where fear drives her." And the firmness of those words rippled outward, settling the crisis before it had a chance to ignite. Silence followed, the kind that exposes truth instead of hiding it, and one by one the riders turned their horses, retreating with muttered frustration while the cowboy remained still until the last hoofbeat faded, ensuring the woman saw the moment her past finally lost its power to drag her back. When they reached the next settlement, a quieter, smaller place tucked between cottonwoods and open pasture, the townspeople paused mid-task as the cowboy led his horse through the main path with the woman walking beside him, the blanket still around her shoulders like a boundary she had finally been allowed to draw. And though her steps were hesitant, there was no rope trailing behind her, no wagon forcing her direction, only the steady presence of the man who had reclaimed her dignity without demanding anything in return. A few locals exchanged glances, recognizing the men who had ridden through earlier with loud accusations and even louder pride, and the murmur that rose among them was nothing like the cruel curiosity she had faced in the first town. This sound held caution, fairness, and a readiness to listen rather than judge. The cowboy dismounted and spoke quietly to the settlement's elder, a weathered man with gentler eyes than the sheriff she had known. And though she couldn't hear what was said, she watched as the elder's expression shifted from concern to understanding. then to something that looked remarkably like disappointment in the behavior of the town she had fled. When the elder approached her, his tone carried neither accusation nor pity, only a simple, respectful, "You're safe here. No one will decide your life for you." And hearing those words from a man who owed her nothing made her throat tighten with a different kind of emotion, relief instead of fear. The few townsfolk who gathered didn't stare the way the last crowd had, and when the elder addressed them, his voice carried enough authority to be heard without shouting. "A woman's refusal is not a crime, and no rope should ever settle a family's pride," a statement that settled over the gathering like a judgment against the injustice she had endured. The woman felt heat prick her eyes as people nodded, agreeing, not because they knew her, but because they understood that right and wrong did not depend on familiarity. She glanced at the cowboy, who stood slightly behind her, deliberately letting the recognition fall on her rather than himself. And in that small act, she saw something she hadn't been given in a long time: the chance to be seen as more than a burden or a problem to be solved. The elder extended his hand to her, offering a place among them, but she looked first to the cowboy, not for permission, but for grounding, and he dipped his head once in the faintest gesture of encouragement, letting her know the choice was hers to claim. For the first time, she took a step forward, not because someone pushed her, but because she wanted to. Dawn found them on the edge of the settlement, where the light slipped softly through the cottonwoods and painted the river in quiet gold. And for the first time in many days, the woman stood without bracing herself for someone's orders or judgments, her hands resting loosely at her sides, as if they finally remembered what it felt like not to be bound by fear. The cowboy stood a few steps away, checking the cinch on his saddle with the unhurried patience of a man who never expected gratitude. And when she approached, he straightened only enough to acknowledge her presence without pressing her to speak, honoring the silence that had carried them from shame to safety. She watched him tighten the last strap, realizing with a small, aching pang that he meant to leave quietly, the way men who protect rather than possess often do. And the realization pushed a fragile sentence to her lips. "I don't know where to go now," spoken not as a plea, but as a truth she had finally earned the right to admit. The cowboy paused, resting one hand on the saddle horn before turning toward her, his expression steady, gentle, carrying none of the urgency other men had used to control her path, and he answered in the same quiet voice that had cut through the cruelty of the street. "You don't have to know today. Just don't let someone else choose it for you again." A line that settled into her chest, like a promise she could build a life upon. She glanced toward the settlement where the elder had offered her a place, then back to the open land stretching westward, and felt, for the first time, a sense of choice unfolding instead of closing around her. The cowboy stepped aside as if making room for whichever direction she dared to name, but when she hesitated with a soft, uncertain breath, he nodded once, offering reassurance without guiding her, letting the decision belong entirely to her. Slowly she lifted her gaze to meet his, and the gratitude there wasn't desperate or indebted, only honest, the kind that came from recognizing someone who had protected her dignity without ever trying to claim her future. She took a single step closer, enough that her voice didn't have to carry far when she said, "If I stay here, will you be nearby long enough for the world to feel steady again?" And the cowboy's reply was a soft, grounded, "Long enough for you to find your footing," before he placed his hat over his heart in a quiet gesture of respect. She didn't need more than that, because the peace settling over her wasn't born from being saved. It was born from being seen, and as the morning light warmed the earth around them, she understood she had finally taken her first step into a life she chose herself. If you saw someone dragged through town like this, would you have stepped forward like the giant cowboy, or stayed silent with the crowd?